Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Liesl Ackley. My mic is way too loud. I'm just going to speak very loudly. I'm one of the assistant pastors here at Park Road. And here at Park Road, we always invite you to love Jesus deeply by worshiping fully, learning humbly, and loving extravagantly. Tonight, we have the great privilege of learning from our friend Jayson Casper. Jayson is a correspondent with Christianity Today. He's stateside for the summer, and he's going to share with us about what devastation abroad can teach us about division at home. So welcome, Jayson.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. It's nice to be with you guys again here at Park Road, and thank you, Liesl, for the introduction. As she said, I am the Middle East correspondent for Christianity Today. I have been reporting on the Arab world and the larger region since about 2011. That was primarily from Cairo, Egypt, but for the last 3 years, my family of 6 has lived in Beirut, Lebanon. Now, one of the things that we try to do at Christianity Today, and just to put up front that a lot of the examples that I'll be using are going to be coming from our unique angle into the evangelical readership that we are trying to educate. But Christianity Today understands itself as thought journalism. So what that means primarily is that we are not required to be breaking news, to be there on the front lines. When something happens in the world, all of the regular media, which has far more resources than we do, is there to cover it, and you can get that from the variety of media that you happen to consume. We try to be as fast as we can, of course, but we want to get as many sources as we can, diverse for our audience, and represent faithfully how people are viewing the situation that has happened to their country. So that when we as Americans are looking into an obscure part of the world that we might just get a few facts and headlines about, what we will be able to do is to read, recognize the type of people who are speaking to us, and then be hit with the diversity of responses that they have to their news. We know, of course, when something happens in America, there's all sorts of people from the church or from other sectors of life that respond differently. As long as I understand, and it's a great job of interpretation, to see that people are representing their viewpoints sincerely, not serving an agenda, I will try to make it my responsibility to cover that honorably. The point is, when you take these incredibly complex parts of the world, you have to boil them down simply so that within 1,000 to 1,500 words, people can get an understanding, a snapshot of what things are like there. But at that same time that you're trying to simplify matters, you have to also aim, in some sense, to confuse them. Because you should be able to walk away at the end of an article saying, wow, I didn't think of that before. I never interpreted it that way. Oh, Christians are taking this in this way? Now, of course, some of the people listening today may not have a Christian or an evangelical viewpoint, and that's quite fine. Our job is first and foremost to represent reality the way that it comes. Christians aren't always right. And so we have to do the job of trying to sift through what our friends in the media will do, of course, on their own, to say, how can we try to get the facts straight and then the interpretations honestly, so that we, if we have a Christian point of view, can pray faithfully, and if not, simply understand better. And even as Americans, to understand what is required of us as we are trying to understand this part of the world. Now, I have primarily covered, my title is as Middle East correspondent, but over the years my responsibilities have expanded to include much of the Muslim world in general, so that can stretch across North Africa or to Indonesia, much of Africa as well, down into the southern hemisphere, but then also the Orthodox world. And much of the Christianity of the Middle East is Orthodox in its orientation. And so having some understanding of what that means to make a leap into other parts of the world is going to be 3 of the hot spots that I have covered today. because today's lecture is going to be, one, so that we can understand different parts of the world and where conflict is raging, but at the same time to say, what does this show us for America? We're going to look at... If there is a backup mic or something that perhaps I can grab it, would that be here or there? Okay. Hopefully that won't happen again. Okay, right. So, 3 parts of the world that I have covered extensively over the past 3 years. One is Lebanon, where we happen to live. Second is Ukraine, where I've taken that leap into Eastern Europe, where I'm not so familiar, but the world is certainly consumed by it. And then a third conflict in the Caucasus region. Armenia and Azerbaijan have been locked, fortunately in a period of peace and negotiation right now, but a deadly conflict that rocked their world about 2 years ago. So we're going to look at this lens, and we're going to try to look at 3 templates that these conflicts can show us for the various conflicts that are taking place in America these days. And maybe there will be some ways and some parallels that we can better understand even our own context and the divisions that are taking place in America these days. So, the first country that we will look at is Lebanon. And, to put it simply, the first template of conflict will be when everyone is wrong. Now, I want to say that carefully. It's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but really, about Lebanon, it's good to start with everything that is right. It's actually a wonderful place to live. It's one of the most free countries in the Middle East altogether. And one of the reasons that I can stand up and say such a thing, that everyone is wrong, is simply the fact that they do it all the time. It's a very complex place. One of the reasons why it's so free, and this is a bit cynical in perspective, of course, is that there is such diversity of religious confession that nobody has power to assert themselves over anyone else. The country is approximately 1/3 Christian, 1/3 Sunni Muslim, 1/3 Shiite Muslim. And within this, if anybody starts to get too far ahead of the other two can just very easily gang up on them and reestablish the stability that exists. Now, that's good in many ways, of course, but one of the other ways that it impacts is that these groups are very adept at sharing the pie with one another, and then after, accusing one another of being corrupt. Every single politician will say of the entire leadership council, they're all corrupt. Not me, of course, but when enough people say it over and over again, and there is good investigative journalism that takes place freely in this country to expose the contracts that go to this religious system or to this political party. It's very easy to see, and every Lebanese person is adept at knowing that their country operates this way. If there's enough money to go around, then there's historically been a wonderful middle class in Lebanon that puts up with it and enjoys the free life that they have to live in. However, 3 years ago, this happened. And there were great protests that swept across Lebanon. Now, these protests were saying, we're now finally fed up with all of your corruption. In a free political system like Lebanon has been historically, you can always protest this issue or against that party or this politician. But what was unique about these protests is that the common people came together and all united against every single political party. And they swept the streets and they brought down the government. But ever since then, things haven't been put back together yet. The country was going through financial difficulties in very large degree because of the corruption. It finally caught up with them, and the government declared itself bankrupt. And the value of their currency devalued up until this present moment about 90%. So the teacher that was making a respectable salary of about maybe $3,000 a month suddenly had a take-home pay equivalent of about $300 a month. And at that same time, the inflation that were happening here in the States and around the world, preceded Lebanon by about 2 years. So as their currency depreciated, all the money had lost its value. And at that very moment, the banking system decided to shut off the bank accounts. So whatever savings you happened to have, you no longer had access to it. So you're just stuck. They've found ways to live, but if this isn't bad enough, you guys will remember as well, this happened next. Half of the city blew up. One of the things that's so difficult about Lebanon in this framework of everyone is wrong is that up until this day, 2 years later, it will be 2 years in August, we still have no idea why it happened or who's responsible. There are lots of facts circulating, of course. We can tie things in this direction, or this political party was controlling the port at that point, or this customs agency here. All sorts of pieces of the puzzle are known, but the judicial system has been stymied. They are not allowing the probe to keep moving forward. As soon as it gets going again, another lawsuit is filed to dismiss the judge or to suspend proceedings. There are some politicians that are causing for it to continue, but even them, if they're not exposed in this avenue, might be exposed in some other way. And so really no one dares to spill the apple cart, because once you inform on your partner in crime, the knives come out and everybody falls. Within this, we come up to the most recent time, and about a couple months ago, Lebanon actually finally moved through this period of we can't believe what's happening to our country, and they had a chance to set things right. Within their political system, as I told you, there were 3 main religious groups. If you want to boil that down, there are actually 18 different religious sects of various weight and consequence in the country. And the largest of these pretty much all have at least 2 or 3 different political parties to choose from. If you think American politics is polarized and in a gridlock, try to sort that mess out. But again, there's great freedom because you can pick and choose who happens to align not only with your religion, but also with your political values. What most often happens, however, is that there really are no political values. The political parties are avenues with which you can achieve patronage for your sect, your family, your geographical area. And then, as long as there's money, everyone gets the slice of the pie. When there isn't, you can imagine what happened. Now, there is ideology in these elections, of course, and one of the issues that really comes down to boil is, what are you going to do with Hezbollah? Hezbollah is a Shiite militia, but it is also a political party, and in terms of the United States and many countries around the world, it is a designated terrorist entity. In Lebanon, however, they are a very powerful agent, and many people will say they are among the least corrupt of all the different political parties. Yet when these protests broke out against the whole political system, it was Hezbollah that had one of the leading roles in trying to stop them. Because their reason to be is to have these weapons, point them against Israel, in order, from their interpretation, to be a defense against Israeli aggression against the state. Historically, they have reason to fear such things. But nonetheless, within every political party, within every religious sect, there are those parties that will align themselves with Hezbollah and say, actually, they're the best thing we have going here. And then there are other sides of that religious sect who will say, no, they are the cause of all of our problems. Get rid of these weapons, let them run fairly in elections, and we can see who represents who. Nonetheless, within this, you can pick and choose to say who your favorites are, but the overwhelming Lebanese consensus popularly is that none of them are worthy of trust. What happened in these last elections are that some of those people who were involved in those protest movements actually did succeed in organizing themselves, and they won a very respectable 10% of the parliament. Not enough to really be able to swing power one way or the other, not enough to reform the system entirely, but enough to make themselves important and perhaps a swing vote as one party works against the other. But now these new parties, these protest parties, have a dilemma of their own. Having campaigned on the idea that everyone is corrupt, how do you now start working with those who are corrupt? How do you choose which corrupt party will be your ally? Well, cause to cause, it might shift. But even more serious, how are you going to prevent yourselves from getting swept up into that same corruption you used to protest? We will see if that slogan, this template of everyone is wrong, is actually going to hold true to include these new parties that have given many Lebanese at least a sliver of hope that things might change. Now, that's one template. There is another. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I didn't advance the slide for the elections. But now here, we move to Ukraine. And if the template of Lebanon is that everyone is wrong, what we're going to say of Ukraine in this battle with Russia is that there is one side that is right. Now, of course, I don't know your viewpoints on this matter, but if you are typical Americans, there might only be one or two of you in this room right now that seems to be questioning whether or not Ukraine is right, that Russia is something that is other than the aggressor party. And it's not my point now to say one party is right in any absolute sense. Of course, we can read the analysis. We can wonder if NATO was expanding to the east a little bit too formally, too quickly, if they were making Ukraine to be a base of operations from which we could undermine Moscow. Or perhaps even if we move further into what the Russians say about this war, we could examine whether or not Ukraine was acting in a discriminatory manner against its Russian-speaking citizens. All of these things are worthy of discussion, but at the end of the day, it is one nation that invaded the other. It is one nation that is raining down missiles on cities, residential locations, and causing complete destruction to another nation. The Ukrainian side is right. The Russians are wrong. Now, if you think ahead to where we're going with this in terms of America, there are times, of course, if we're going to use it as a template, in which one side is right. The other side is wrong. But how do we do this? How do we report it faithfully? One of the first articles, of course, is simply to tell what's happening. And so when the Russians invaded, we did our best that next day in order to simply say what's going on in these churches. Again, the evangelical focus of Christianity today brings that sector of society to the fore. And we wanted our readers to understand how it was that the churches started to suffer. Now, if you can read that small script, in the subtitle there, one of the things that we tried to bring forward was, what are Christians thinking about this invasion? And what you can see there is something very noble at the very end of it. It says that we are trying to avoid human hate. A few days later, you can see how the sentiment changed. Here again, the war is continuing, the destruction is expanding, Kyiv is getting hit as a city, and we're going to take a moment to focus on the seminaries, those providing Christian education to the evangelicals of Ukraine. And what are they saying now, and how are they praying? Well, certainly for an end to the war, but also to break the bones of my enemy. And when you're dealing with this type of a template in which one side is wrong and one side is right, you can see how in the depth of suffering, it can be very easily to move from something that is noble to that which is natural. How we love our enemies, of course, is a Christian concept. That you pray to break their bones is a biblical concept that they are drawing from Scripture. These are seminary professors. They know how to interpret Scripture. But yet, in the depth of their troubles, these are the prayers that they are praying against the Russians. Reporting has to faithfully cover those who are being hurt. But that's not the only thing to cover. A later article, point in that direction. Yes. How are the Russians responding? Do all the Russians accept the viewpoint put out by their government? What about the Christians, or even the evangelicals? You see, one of the things that happened once the Soviet Union fell is that the post-Soviet states, the evangelicals in each one, had a very concerted effort to work together. Now, they primarily did this in Russian language, but the very diverse people from Ukraine to the Baltic states to the Central European republics, some of which were Muslim majority, all cooperated together. And so this great camaraderie that existed in one united religion now is put to the test. How are we as fellow believers going to deal with the political conflict between our nation, especially in one, from the Ukrainian perspective, that we are simply being abused? Now, the Russians may have their perspective and their justification for everything that they're doing, but certainly in faith you could speak up against that, can you not? Some Russians are. And this article told the story of those Russians who are at some and perhaps great risk to themselves criticizing the policy of the Russian government. There are others, of course, who have been taught that one of the things most important in faith is not to get involved in corrupt politics. And the Russians view this war as an extension of politics, and it's not our place to say yes or no to what the government is doing. Our job is simply to preach the gospel and to serve society. The Ukrainians want nothing to do with this. But from the Russian perspective, they are wondering, one, do I risk? Two, it's not my place. And then three, there are a good number of these fellow believers to the suffering Ukrainians who are saluting President Putin and saying this is necessary for our nation, that it is actually Russia and the strength of Russia that is going to be the strongest defense of Christianity in this world. And Ukrainians, look at how liberal and Western they are becoming. Many Russian Christians are with the invasion. So reporting does have to faithfully cover, one, it happened, two, what's the impact it's having, three, how is the other side viewing it, and then fourth, trying to ask ourselves a question. Of course, I'm asking them, but some of those Russian Christians are going to be in prison now. Some Orthodox priests have been jailed for what their stance they have taken. And that the Ukrainians, no matter how many people are saying something as carefully as they can, and there are some Russian Christians who are very carefully trying to say just enough to criticize without getting in trouble, this has zero patience whatsoever from the Ukrainians. They are actually recalling the example of the German theologian you may be familiar with, who during World War II not only criticized Hitler and the Nazi regime, he actually joined a resistance movement to assassinate him. He was captured, imprisoned, and executed for the crime against the state only a short amount of time before the war ended. But that example of what Bonhoeffer did is exactly what the Ukrainians want to see their Russian brothers and sisters risking. Should they? Morally, is it demanded of them? Or is it simply, I won't support it, I'll be silent, and I'll carry on with the ministry that God has given me? It's not an easy question, but in order to, as I said before, not only try to simplify complex issues, but to confuse our readers, where are we on this? Is there a right answer? And hopefully in all of this, the reporting can cover such things. But finally, we give up the moral ambiguity to actually say this is a travesty. Sometimes one side is right and the other side is wrong. And what do we see going on here? There came a point that in the Orthodox Church, despite the best efforts of the Ukrainians and the Russians to hold to the unity of their faith, even as they were greatly at odds with one another, whatever the date there is, perhaps a month or two ago, they said enough. And we are breaking our fellowship. Our unity cannot hold. Sad, but sometimes when there's a right and a wrong, one must take a moral stand. And the Ukrainians have decided to do that. There is one final template for us to consider, and for that, we go to the Caucasus, where all sides are not sure if you have followed this conflict in the news. This is actually going to be one of the riskiest ones, because here it's not cut or dried. In Lebanon, everyone knows everyone's corrupt. I might get in trouble for saying so against this party or against my friend who's with this party or this religion, but everyone knows there's nothing at stake. When everyone knows that there's one person right, you can take a stand, but there's going to be so many people backing you up in that stand, you'll feel secure, unless, of course, you're on the other side, and then you have a choice to make about silence or not. But when the sides are somewhat right, somewhat wrong, a little of both, you risk everything by saying anything. Unless, of course, you stick with your group. You stick with your group and you'll be fine. But what's happening in this obscure part of the world? And our readers, of course, evangelicals, Christianity today, is most naturally going to side with that nation of Armenia. They are a historic Christian nation. In fact, they are the oldest officially Christian nation in the entire world. They adopted the religion way back in 301, before the Roman Empire accepted Christianity. And so they may or they may not be exactly like us in faith, but if we're going to have a religious affinity to somebody, it's not going to be the Muslim majority Azerbaijanis who launched the war against Armenia. Now, it has to be made a little bit more complicated than that as well, because, okay, from my faith, my religious, my cultural expression, I may prefer that nation, but if I look as an American, we actually have a very good, strong allied relationship with Azerbaijan. The Armenians are most closely allied with Russia. They are closely allied with Iran. Whereas the Azerbaijanis, despite being a Shiite Muslim nation in their majority, have great relations with Israel. And so the geopolitical world just gets turned up on its head when you try to mix politics and religion into all of this. But what am I support? Is my nationality going to make me root for one side or another? Is my religion? Okay, well, let's just put that aside. Who cares, right? It's our job to figure out who's right and who's wrong. Well, even here, it's not so simple. I started off by saying that 2 years ago, Azerbaijan launched this war against Armenia. That's not quite the case, and it doesn't tell the whole story. Right before the Soviet Union fell, these two boundaries, these two entities, were republics within the Soviet Union. And as they anticipated the Soviet Union collapse, they each wanted to establish their independence and get the little territory that they could. And it was Armenia, in a time of mutual conflict, that was able to take the advantage, press ahead, and take that contested area right in between the two nations. Now, the way the borders were drawn, that contested area is officially Azerbaijani sovereign territory. The people who live there, however, are ethnically Armenian. So if we want to jump back in this story even further, we'll go back a century. Because when, I believe it was Joseph Stalin, before he was the leader of Russia, he had responsibility to actually draw these borders of how the Soviet Union would apportion its republics. And in a divide and conquer strategy known to rulers all over the world, he decided to draw that little part of Azerbaijan to take the territory where the Armenians were living. So our world today operates on two principles. One, that there is borders that must be respected. If we're going to judge this principle, clearly in this war, Azerbaijan is right. Armenia seized control of land that did not belong to it. In fact, it actually seized more land, and it cleared out hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijani citizens to establish a buffer zone to protect this land where ethnic Armenians were living. Negotiations had been going on for 30 years, accomplishing nothing. And finally, the strength reversed, and with great support from Turkish drones, the Azerbaijanis were able to pound Armenian positions until they surrendered. And the result of this is that the Azerbaijanis took back the property that Armenia had taken from them 30 years earlier. But that's only one principle, the way the world is organized. There's a second one, and that is self-determination. We believe that the peoples of this world have the right to govern themselves. So why are these ethnic Armenians condemned to be citizens of a nation that doesn't respect them, that many Armenians fear wants to get rid of them, if not outright kill them? Now, to some degree, I am repeating the way that Armenians talk, but it's certainly true that much Azerbaijani political discourse has compared those Armenian residents in that piece of land to rats, insects. The average Azerbaijani may have no problem at all with his Armenian friends, but the leadership of an autocratic Azerbaijani state has not been friendly to the Armenians, whereas the very democratic Armenian state has been saying, just give us this piece of land back, it's where our people live. We have no agenda to take your territory whatsoever. Who's right? Who's wrong? What do you do when the template says that, well, maybe they're both right, but yet we see in conduct they're also both wrong? Well, the reporting will do its best. The first thing that you do is just describe the suffering that starts. 30 years there was negotiation in a frozen status quo that was disturbed by Azerbaijani aggression. They are the ones that launched the war to take back their territories and impose suffering on so many Armenians in that area. Armenians were terrified. At the same time, I had the ability to touch base with the very small Christian population of Azerbaijan. And I heard from them that, one, this Muslim-Christian conflict has nothing to do with religion. At the time, many Armenians were saying the Muslims are out to get us. There's going to be a genocide if we're not careful. The Armenians were saying, we're Christians like them, but we support our government to get our land back, as we should. One of the interesting things about this small Christian minority is if you want to say which side are you going to support and play that game of human rights again, as I said, there is a firm, universally acknowledged dictatorship in Azerbaijan that has no political freedom whatsoever, but yet, unlike most Muslim nations in the world, they give full freedom to convert away from the Islamic faith. And this church has some of Russian ethnicity in Azerbaijan, but yet most of them today are converts from Islam who have found Jesus as their Savior. They are like us, at least in terms of Christianity Today readership. So we want to hear that side of the story as well and see, why do you support your nation in this war against fellow Christians? Now, it's not enough just to put both sides. Of course, there is context that must come. When the Armenians are speaking of a feared genocide, that the Muslims want to run them out of a land that they had inhabited for centuries, well, that happened to Armenians in Turkey, of course, just 100 years ago. So there is a memory whenever they are driven from their territory. Now, Azerbaijan says, we do not want to drive these Armenians from their territory. We simply want our land back, and we will treat these Armenians as citizens of Azerbaijan. We are a multi-ethnic state. We have Russian Christians. We have convert Christians. We can have Armenian Christians too. But in the context of a historical genocide, in the context of a political rhetoric that is also saying at the same time, that these Armenians are like dogs, there is much room for Armenians to be fearful. But it gets worse. If I'll take just another minute to add another wrinkle to this story. Armenia has historic churches, monasteries, that go back centuries. 301 AD was a long time ago. 500, 6th century, 7th century, there are Christian buildings traced back to Armenia in the territory of Azerbaijan, in this disputed land, that belong to it. At the same time, if we look back in history, there are another people who you've never heard of before, I'm almost certain, called Caucasian Albanians. They have nothing to do with the Albanians that you do know from over in the Balkans, but the Caucasian Albanians were an ancient Christian sect that no longer exists. Except they do, somewhat. There is a very infinitesimally tiny trace of this church in Azerbaijan. And it is clear historically that some of these ancient buildings belong to them. However, what Azerbaijan is doing in order to assert historic control over these properties where they do not live, Armenians live there, they are saying, and in fact going to some of these buildings and changing them to make it look as if they are not Armenian churches, but Caucasian Albanian churches, because they do have representatives of this ancient, almost dead Christian sect within their historic population. Now, I'd have to take far more time to really make this explainable. I hope you get enough of it just in this. But again, the Armenians fear not just a physical genocide, but a cultural genocide. That their churches, their heritage, are going to be changed into something else that will serve to deny their historic presence in the land. Finally, if this template is about both sides being somewhat right, both sides being somewhat wrong, you have to do your best to find the reconciliation. Now, this article is almost trying to find one where it doesn't exist, but there are efforts between the religious representatives of these two countries to find a way towards peace. It's honorable, it's failing, but yet, can we even, in this small evangelical Christian opinion, where, like with Ukrainians and Russians, there was an effort. Sure, I'll let that hang. And that does it. Okay. Excuse me. Is there a place for religion to be able to help solve political conflict? Not much. We shouldn't be optimists, but we should try to report where we can. Sure, try this one. Thanks. We're moving towards American conflict. Before we do that, let's review. Sometimes in this world, no one is right. Everyone is screwing up the system. Sometimes it's clear that there is a party, there is a right and a wrong, and there are those who are defending the wrong for whatever purposes they claim. Sometimes, perhaps often, it's not clear. There are principles that are operating contradictory to one another, and sorting out the right and the wrong is not always easy. What do we do with this template? Will you tell me? If this was not simply a presentation, I might ask you to break up into groups and to go through these issues and categorize them. Which ones are examples of everyone being wrong? which ones are, there is clearly a right and a wrong, and which ones are kind of mixed up and it's not clear exactly, which ones have principles that operate contradictorily to one another. I don't know. There is going to be a question and answer after this in which you can grill me and I will not answer your questions. However, you may ask, and I'll turn it back on you. It's not easy to sort these things out. Depending on whether you fall on the political right, the political left, religiously conservative, religiously liberal, these things are not going to find easy answer in a diverse group. And even in a like-minded group, some of us may categorize it as right and wrong, clearly. Some of us may say, well, there's contradictory principles involved. And then with others, we might just say a pox on all your houses, as the Lebanese do. What do we do when all sides are wrong? I will, in each of these templates, go over some of the advantages and the disadvantages that come if the issue that divides us falls into a certain template. I don't pretend that I've exhausted all the possibilities, but I hope this is useful. 1, when everyone is wrong, one of the disadvantages that comes is that we can think there's nothing to be done about it. We wind up united in despair, in discouragement. Certainly this is the case in Lebanon. A long time ago, most Lebanese gave up on trying to fix the system. You can't. There's no one to ally with. There's no good guy to find. So what do? You just throw up your hands and there's nothing to be done. When everyone is wrong, this is what happens. And it gets worse. Because if there's nothing that you can do to fix everything, you're going to look out for yourself, for your group. Even if you want to do what's right, you might be able to have some influence so that your group does what's right. But what's going to happen from that? Well, no one else will. And so you're just going to make yourself weaker. And in the end, why bother? Let's just squeeze the system as best we can, as ethically as we can, so that we at least take care of ourselves. Even to some degree, that is noble. It's right to support your own kind. But what happens when you have so many kinds in one nation? When everyone is wrong, there's a lot working against you. But there are advantages. One of the things that happens is that when everyone is wrong, no one holds to an opinion strongly. You realize that, yeah, you're right. I'm out for myself. I might confuse it with a principle. I might dress it up so it looks good. But at the end of the day, when you're knocking heads, no one's really going to hold strongly to the fact that I'm right here, because nobody is. One of the benefits is that you're not going to run into entrenched opinions. But what also happens, and this is what some Lebanese are discovering in their protests, in their election efforts, is that when everything is wrong, everything is open and possible. Well, maybe this will work. Maybe that can happen. All of a sudden, you can think outside of the box because the traditional ways of solving problems just aren't going to work. So maybe this might. Maybe I can change something small here. As you consider the various American issues, if you put them into this category and you pause and do the hard work of trying to creatively think, you might be able to come up with something that works. Well, there's another template. What happens if the issues that you care about, the 2 or the 3 on that big list you want to put your mind towards? Obviously, some of those issues, I imagine you think there is a right and a wrong here. Well, there are advantages that we'll start with if your issue falls into this category. 1, mobilization is easy. When there's a right and a wrong, it's pretty easy to convince people to join your side. There's no moral conundrum to sort through. You're right, I'll help you here. And as we look at Ukraine, a lot of what has happened in America and much of the Western world and the whole world in many ways has been, I will salute that flag. I will support this cause. Mobilization is easy. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, there's another advantage first. Unity is possible. Just think of the great outpouring of American support for Ukraine in this cause. Our tremendous American polarization has largely been overcome as people who disagree about this and this and this and this all say, yep, Ukraine's right. Where there are things of right and wrong, you can work with people who disagree with you on other stuff. And that's a great advantage for the cause. Unity becomes possible. Unfortunately, demonization becomes easy. When there's a right and a wrong, who are those wrong people? How can they say that? What are they doing? They're just selfish. They're just evil. That's the way we will tend to think when we frame an issue in terms of right and wrong. I'm not saying that this don't exist, but when we enter this template, the disadvantage, the danger, is that it becomes very easy to make every Russian guilty, as I saw in a meme that was circulated among some of the Ukrainian evangelicals that I know. Those people who at the beginning of the war were praying for that honorable solution to avoid human hate. They've succumbed. And also, interest can wane. Now, if your cause is right, you're going to win, of course, yes? You have everybody behind you. All the momentum is with you. You're going to win, of course. But then you don't, or at least as fast as you might have hoped to. And then when that happens, and it becomes a real battle, well, those who truly care along with you, they'll stick with you, of course. They'll keep fighting. But everybody else who is part of your coalition, who it's not their main cause, they'll get tired. They'll fall away. Now, that's not going to happen to the Ukrainians, of course, who are under this war, but all their friends around the world might not be such great friends in the next coming months, when things start to get cold, when gas prices get too high. Oh, we support them, of course, but maintaining interest when there is a right and a wrong is hard because most people don't care enough about the issue you care about terribly. One other template. When all sides are, I don't know what. Well, this actually can be very helpful too. One, you're not going to lose interest because when things are contested, you're not going to give up. And in many times, it becomes a zero-sum battle. It becomes an existential crisis. That land that's being contested right there in between these two nations, those people aren't going to change their mind. Armenia is not going to change their mind about defending them. And Azerbaijanis are not going to change their mind about this being our territory. So within these two places, those who care about the issue like you, the advantage of being an unclear concept from the outside is that from the inside, there's no disclarity at all. You're going to keep the strength of your argument. You're not going to lose your supporters because you dare not lose, or else the other side triumphs, and you can't deal with that. However, if you can, even within the conflict, recognize that, okay, those people are operating on a principle, not necessarily out of hatred against me, you can conceivably negotiate. You can figure out, okay, I'll give you this, you give me this. I'm not going to get everything I want, and neither will you, but we'll come to some sort of agreement that we can at least live together. Now, bring your template back to your American issue. Can you do this? I don't know if you can. But at least when there are contested visions of what is right and what is wrong, principles on both sides, it is conceivable that there can be solutions found through negotiation. However, it's very difficult. In a situation like this, you become locked in. When everyone is wrong, nobody really holds any principles. You'll just give it up if you need to. But when a principle is involved, when right and wrong is at stake, nobody changes their mind easily. And so this issue may never get solved because I am going to hold to what I think is right. Maybe you should. But in terms of the conflict, this is certainly a disadvantage of the template we find ourselves in. And, the middle is vulnerable. Those people who would dare say something against the absolute rightness of their cause are going to get killed. And we need to be aware of this when we are locked into a battle where both sides might be right about certain things. Those who try to bring them together will be working against firm agendas, power, money, certainly principle. But my team, I can't do anything to help them lose. If I give up something, they will get the advantage over us. And anyone who tries to work in that middle is at great risk. It's a disadvantage in this type of a conflict. I hope I have found an antidote, to each one of them. Again, there may be many more than these. But maybe, again, keep your American issues in mind, these things might help. 1, well, there is only one. The antidote is to find the common good. If we can shift our mentalities away from the absolute templates that are going to represent our conflicts into something that transcends them, goes above them to say, how does this help everyone? We might be able to start making progress. That does not mean giving up right and wrong. It simply means expanding your view of what's going on to say, how does this help everyone? How can we find peace in our disagreements? So, when everyone is wrong, we must join together. This isn't so difficult necessarily, but it could be because there are plenty of things that divide us in our little affairs of this world. But when it comes to fixing the issue that we all agree is terrible, work together. Give up your disagreements about this, that, or the other thing, and find your ally who can solve the problem that's afflicting our entire nation. When the issue is everyone knows it's wrong and we can't fix it, then find those who you can work with. To some degree, if you're now operating on a principle for the good of all, you might actually be able to win some of those semi-corrupt people to your side. And that anticipates the next antidote. When you find that there is a right and a wrong issue, it becomes necessary to make a moral appeal to the other side. Now, it could be that you just crush them. You let your rightness triumph. You let your military triumph. You beat them back, you kill them, you embarrass them, you cancel them, you do something to them, and you might win in the end. But does that win? Does that help the common good? It simply just drives the issues that divide us deeper and deeper, and it makes losers out of people who stay frustrated and will increasingly tend towards more extreme matters to get their side back. We see this the world over. If there is to be a common good solution where right and wrong is at stake, that's the third, where there is a clear right and wrong, those people on the other side can only be appealed to through morality. And I think this would work, because if you are on the side of evil, the wrong side, most people are not choosing that to be evil. They're swept up in it. They've given themselves over to it. But it's not easy to kill someone. If you are the aggressor in a war, to say, this isn't right. Now, you attach your agenda, your own opinion, your own perspective to that moral cause, it'll be dismissed. But if you can consistently say, for the common good, please stop, this isn't right, most people's consciences, I think, would be affected. And it becomes possible to win someone to the rightness of your side, whereas triumphing over them may win the day, but not the person. not the common good. And so the third one, again, the most difficult of them all, do you dare approach that middle where you become vulnerable? If there are Armenians and Azerbaijanis listening into this right now, of course I am putting myself in their crosshairs. But the Armenians lost. The Azerbaijanis took control, they sent their drones, they took their land back. What would have happened if a few years earlier, when the Armenians had the upper hand, they had said, we shouldn't have taken these lands. Okay, yes, this land where Armenians live, this belongs to us. We're not going to give that up. That's an issue of right and wrong. But in order to achieve that, we drove away and displaced thousands of your people to become refugees, depopulated whole cities in order to secure our safety. Now, tactically, it's useful. Politically, it helps. Militarily, all of these things make sense. It's defensible in some way. But it seems wrong to me that they did that. If they had simply said, we shouldn't have done that, might that have stimulated the negotiations? Might the Azerbaijanis have said, yeah, you're right, and in fact, we've been doing things that we shouldn't have either? When you are in a principle versus principle contest, where things are contested, there's right and there's wrong on both sides, I think the antidote is start with yourself and your side. Confess where your faults lie. That might be some way to find the common good necessary in a moral appeal to some degree that says, what do we do now? How do we fix this? So where do these fall? What category do you put these issues into? Do these anecdotes make a difference? In fact, that's the final question. Will it work? I don't know. And here is where I think, to some degree, we come back to a matter of faith. Common good isn't much more than that. Christianity Today is an evangelical magazine. I might be able to say, if this was a religious message that I was delivering, the Bible says this, do it. It doesn't matter if you lose. There's a code you have to follow. And to a religious believer, that is an argument that cannot be dismissed. I might have interpreted it wrong. We might not know how to live out that principle, but we can't get away from what we are told to do by God. But if we step back from God, as most of this lecture has been, we're still left with faith. If we care about the common good, if we simply want our triumph, then let's do what we need to do to get it done. Let's step on whoever we need to in order for our side to win, our vision to triumph. But if we care to be moral people, we are left with the question of, will it work? Once I start behaving morally, it often doesn't help in this world. Or maybe it will. How do you view humanity? Are we going to do what's right, or are we going to do what's wrong? And with these issues, how do you parse them out? Do we dare seek the good of all amid the convictions that we have, no matter what template we find ourselves in? And, like a good article, I hope I have simplified many complex areas of this world and left us in deep confusion as what to do about it. Thank you very much, and we can take some questions now. And if there are none, then I get to go home easily. Yes?
Jayson, can you just, you've met your family before, can you just tell us how you and your family are doing stateside and what's, plans from you?
My family is enjoying a break from the chaos that is Lebanon and the lack of electricity and all the sorts of problems that are hitting that wonderful nation on the head. My oldest daughter is 15, 16 next month, 2 months, starting to look at universities. The kids are going to various camps this summer. Our youngest is 9 years old, and they're all just good kids and almost always a joy to live with.
You have an apartment or a home you're going back to? I kind of forget.
Yes. We have a wonderful family. My in-laws host us kindly, and we get to be very near family for all of our interactions when we're back in America.
That's here.
Yes, here in Pennsylvania rather than New Jersey. But
Now your child coming up, or how far away is college?
entering junior year. So
Out to the States, I mean, what are you thinking? Do you know?
that seems to be her preference. If you have suggestions or scholarships, I would be happy to learn of them.
I have a question from online.
Sure.
What do you see as the future of the war in Ukraine? Where do you see things heading?
Fortunately, I am not an analyst. So my answer will be judicial and vague and elusive. But we see, as I hinted in the general discussion, that it will be very hard to maintain Western unity on this issue. But it may also be hard for Russia to maintain its internal cohesion. It seems, according to some of the things that I've read, that Russia would be satisfied with a stalemate, at least at this moment in time. That would be a great amount of effort that they have expended and wasted to basically stay where they started from. But at the same time, there have been objectives that they have achieved. So, will the Ukrainians be able to drive back the Russians to reclaim their entire territory? That's really the gist of what this question is. We can certainly see a stalemate. Conceivably, we could see the Russians finally killing enough Ukrainians to push through. It's possible, especially if the supply of Western weapons does not keep up. So, will it keep up? That's a political question. Are our leaderships able to keep Americans caring enough to withstand a lack of gas, withstand high prices? How do you judge your politicians to make that cause? How do you judge yourself in order to make a sacrifice for that far-off nation that doesn't really impact us too much here in America? Do you care that deeply? It's an easy bet to say no. But the Ukrainians care, and let's suppose that we are willing to keep printing money and supplying this flow of weapons that's necessary to create the stalemate that has happened, keep destroying Russian equipment that their economy cannot keep churning out as rapidly as ours can. Can they push back? I wouldn't put it past the Ukrainians. They have shown enough so far. And if we maintain that official support and let the populations kind of forget about it to whatever degree that is necessary, it's hard to see that happening. But again, I'm not an analyst, and we dare not predict the future. So, sorry, no real answer there.
Well, one more question.
Okay.
From the uniquely evangelical perspective, do you see any particular advantages to the evangelical worldview in terms of navigating division and disagreement? Do you see any disadvantages in which evangelicals are more prone to division than some of the other groups that you've worked among?
If we describe evangelical as the current political moment, then I would say it's easy for any religious group to get sucked into an identity politics that can pull in any one direction or another. We are humans, we are citizens, this is normal. So the advantage in principle of being able to overcome that is that the gospel calls people to care for all of humanity. Do good to your brother and to the world at large. So by rights, we should be able to hold unity, certainly amongst ourselves, of everyone of like faith, and with much of the world with which we have no inherent reason to be against them. So yes, I would say that if the end goal is to find a common good, then the principles of evangelicalism are a great asset towards that cause. If that question becomes, are the principles of evangelicalism going to be helpful to achieve an outcome in this world? I would say probably not, because one of the principles of the gospel is that we do not fight with the weapons of this world. And so therefore there are tools available for non-evangelicals to use that we cannot do. Now, we might do them anyway. But if we live according to that morality, they have advantages over us unless God is going to step in. And will he or won't he is the eternal question. And goodness, anytime anyone is going to simply say, God is with us, you're creating another terrible danger, because now we're entering into that world in which demonization becomes possible. And can we follow the principles of evangelicalism consistently enough to resist that in ourselves? Well, that's a losing battle by clear evidence throughout much of human history. But if we're able to, and we lose, even then the principles of evangelicalism are still good for the common good, because the other principle that we follow is that of resurrection. Our loss might still be gain. God is able to take that which has been destroyed and rebuild it. And so if we place our faith in God, is he going to achieve what we want him to do in this world? Well, we are too human to be able to sift our viewpoints into his, and will most likely fail. But trying to draw back to a firm answer for the question at large, do you believe what you believe because it's true or because it's useful? I would say a full grappling with faith has to make it both. That it's true and we will believe it no matter what comes. But it's useful because what God intends is good for the world. And even if we don't get what we want, it's still best for the world. But to operate in this manner, I would say that the evangelical faith does offer the world much if it can be lived. Whether we can do that or not is a fair question. Okay, any other questions? Thank you so much. Appreciate you guys being here and those listening online, and God bless and bring peace to these 4 places that we have talked about today.